I really think we're on the precipice of addressing quote unquote idiopathic cardiomyopathy in a new way, where we can look at the root causes, whether it's amyloid, and there's a lot of obviously research on amyloid and new therapies for amyloid, but all these different genetic cardiomyopathies, we know there's a genetic root cause, and now with technology we can, up titrate or down titrate almost any gene. And that's going to allow us, as opposed to being reactive when we treat cardiomyopathy, to be proactive.
When saving lives is what you do, your standards are anything but standard. In fact, you set them higher than most to deliver results that patients can depend on. You refuse to compromise. We couldn't agree more. We are Edwards Life Sciences, and like you, we believe that good is never good enough. Rising to the challenge of today's TAVR patients isn't just a mission, it's a commitment. And because you set a higher standard, we set our sights on meeting you there. Welcome to the higher standard, your standard. Learn more at edwardstavr.com.
You're listening to Parallax from Radcliffe Cardiology in association with makeadent.org. Here is your host, Ankur and Eric, MD from the Cleveland Clinic.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Parallax. I have the distinct honor and pleasure of having with me Dr. Adler for this show. Eric Adler is Professor of Medicine and Medical Director of the Heart Transplant Program at University of California, San Diego. And Eric and I actually initially connected on Clubhouse. I was really inspired to hear about his story and about what he's done for a rare disease, a rare cardiomyopathy in cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular medicine. And, I thought would be a great guest to host for Parallax because, that is the kind of conversation our audience thrives on and wants to hear. So, Eric, thank you so much for doing this, and belated happy birthday to your wife.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So, Eric, let me start by asking you about your foray into medicine before we get into cardiology and advanced heart failure. What inspired you to become a physician?
I didn't come from a family of physicians, and I had always been interested in science, but I was actually an English major. I was interested in creative writing. I was very interested in poetry. And it was about halfway through college, or about a year and a half into college, I would say, that I realized my favorite writers actually had experiences to draw upon for their fiction. They needed narratives, and the occupation of just being a writer without any narratives to inspire you just didn't sit well with me. It didn't seem, I wanted to experience things, and I loved kind of the human condition, and I still really had a love for science, passion for science, and I spent a night volunteering in an emergency room between my second and third year of college at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens. And I was just energized and fascinated by the human experience and the stories and the people and the pace. And I came back to college kind of doubling down on that. I was going to switch gears and go into medicine with this idea that I still wanted to be a writer and draw upon all the experiences that I was witness to as a physician as kind of an inspiration.
Yeah, wow. So, that actually is very relatable to me because, I always wanted to be a writer. Actually, when you mentioned creative writing and poetry, I don't know if you know, I'm actually a published poet.
Oh, wow. Really? Oh, that's amazing.
My first poetry book, which is a prelude to a fiction novel that I'm working on, actually was released last year on Valentine's Day.
Oh, that's amazing.
And
I'm going to definitely look for it.
yeah, and it's an anthology of 30 poems, but we can talk about that more, more off the line.
Yeah.
So getting back to your foray into medicine, so that is very fascinating. And I remember Elmhurst, because I interviewed there for cardiology fellowship, and I remember that day. It's a busy inner city hospital, and you meet fascinating people, and not only in the form of patients, but also healthcare providers from different walks of life. And yes, I think for a creative writer, that's a very rich environment to be.
That's right. The most languages anywhere in the world are spoken in the zip code of Elmhurst Hospital in Queens. The most concentration of cultures.
I agree.
And yeah, no, so it's an incredible place. I only, it was just this one brief night, but you have these sometimes in retrospect, you look back at these pivotal moments, and that clearly was one for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So walk us through what happened after that particular experience. So after you went back to college.
Yeah. Well, I doubled down on a career in medicine, and kind of, I made a pact with my best friend. Neither of us were great students, and we came. I think it was the beginning of our junior year, and we were roommates, and we wrote on the wall, "We are going to get our lives together." And we doubled down, and he's become a successful kind of music entrepreneur, and owns a bunch of music venues, and but he kind of got his stuff together, and I got my pre-med stuff together, and I got into BU for med school, and attended BU med school, and I think the next kind of pivotal thing for me was I struggled with med school with the kind of the breadth instead of depth of any one thing. And it was like I would get really into one topic, and then we would move on to the next thing. And you really couldn't be efficient if you dove into any one area, right? Because you were moving, so the pace of things is so fast in the first 2 years of med school. So I kind of was a little disillusioned. I think things have gotten better for med school, but when I was going, it was such a competitive environment of everyone look at each other's grades and this kind of stuff, and everyone worrying about what residency they could get into, and et cetera. And so I struggled the first 2 years, I would say, in terms of not academically, but just almost emotionally, where I really wanted. I had gone right from from undergraduate to med school, and so I saw this sign on walking the hallway. Would you like to take a year off? And are you interested in cardiovascular research? And I had just done a block in cardiology, my second year block, and it was for a 1 year cardiovascular research fellowship, and something called a Sarnoff fellowship. And I read this thing, and on a whim said, write an essay and describe a scientific question of interest, and you may have the opportunity to take a year at any lab in the United States and spend a dedicated year doing cardiovascular research. So I went for it and applied, and I didn't really know. I had some lab experience, throughout college, so I knew a little bit about how to write a scientific question. And the mentor, you had to find a mentor in your institution. And I was super naive, but I kind of looked into my institution who had been affiliated in cardiology and would serve as a mentor, an application. And there was Joseph Loscalzo. So I, as a second year med student, had no idea who he was or anything. And I kind of made an appointment to see him. And I put down this essay, and I said, I want to be a Sarnoff fellow. I really didn't even know much about it. And I didn't really know, when you're a second year medical student, you can, in retrospect, it actually was crazy how kind of unprepared I was to walk into that office. But uh, Dr. Loscalzo was amazing. He proofread my essay, and I remember getting the essay back from him, and there's like red marks all over it. And I'm like, who's this guy, writing all over my essay? I didn't realize it was literally an associate editor of New England Journal. The second, getting edited. And, the quote unquote chutzpah I had that I was just walking in, like, help me with my, my second year med student essay. But he served as my quote unquote sponsor for my application. Of course, he went on to become, editor of circulation and chair of medicine at the Brigham. But this is when he was chair of medicine at BU, I believe, at the time. So he helped prepare me for the application process, and you actually do an interview, and I was awarded the Sarnoff. And that was the next kind of big pivotal thing, because I had to find a lab and do a year of cardiac research.
Yeah, but boy, that's an amazing story, just in and of itself, running into Joe Loscalzo.
Yeah.
And not knowing that he is the Joe Loscalzo.
Yeah, exactly. I'm pretty embarrassed now just talking about it.
And then just, having him edit your essay.
Yeah.
It's pretty neat. Like, that's such a good story.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And,
yeah, of course.
With the listenership. And, have you told this to Joe Loscalzo in the same way as you are now to us? Or?
Yeah, he's been I haven't spoken to him probably in 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer, but he remained a kind of a mentor for me subsequently, after the Sarnoff and through cardiology fellowship, and always someone that I could go to. And one of the Sarnoff is it was started by Stanley Sarnoff, who was with Braunwald at the NIH when they were doing kind of pivotal physiologic studies, and is a giant in the field of cardiac physiology. And he also is the inventor of the EpiPen. And because of that, he left. He always had a thing where he would have a medical student take a year off and spend a year in his lab. And he thought that was so important to get students out of their comfort zone into another institution and focus on research. And so when in his will, he left to establish the Sarnoff Foundation, essentially, which now is close to 30 years old, somewhere between that, and is focused on giving between 8 and 12 medical students a year off to do research at another institution besides their own. And Dr. Loscalzo remained a big part of the Sarnoff Foundation. He eventually became head of the scientific board, and I think head of the board of directors even at one point. So as a Sarnoff, you stay in the alumni kind of for the rest of your life, essentially. And so we meet once a year and with all the other former Sarnoffs, and there's a litany of Sarnoff alumni that have done great things now in industry and academics. So that's been a great community for me. And it was a really important year for me. I spent the year in San Francisco between my second and third years of medical school and did research on interleukin signaling in cardiomyocytes with Carlin Long and Paul Simpson at UCSF. And that year really opened my eyes to how research could kind of fill that itch for me, that in the same way, and it seems tangential, but kind of writing and poetry and research is very different, but it's also about, asking the right questions, creating, there's a narrative to research that's really important, that has to be there. And then there's this kind of search for truth. All those things really resonated with me with research. I had this really impactful year.
Yeah, no, I mean, so you hit some incredible notes, which are, I mean, that's sort of my final common pathway, if you will, between, a writer who's trying to create something, and that something is created when you have that reckoning of truth within your heart, right? And you want to sort of, it's like being the seeker of truth. I completely resonate with that, both as a researcher as well as, I mean, I do not do the kind of research you do. I do clinical/outcomes research, but essentially, when you said narrative for research, I mean, you have to ask the relevant questions, and sort of be the seeker for truth, and then let your findings, guide you to your next question.
Absolutely. And you can't be, obviously there's big differences between poetry and research, but if you're not finding a compelling narrative in your story, like if you can't convince anyone else that the research you're doing is important, you're not going to get very far, right? And we all know, like, the best researchers, when you see their talk, and you might not be interested in that topic, but you get inspired. And that's because they know how to weave it together and convince you why the research is compelling. And that's a big part of it. There's probably a lot of great researchers that can't do that, and they never get very far.
Yeah, that's, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. It's like the universe conspired for us to have this conversation.
Yeah.
I've never thought of clinical research from the angle of a creative writer or a poet, as eloquently as you've described it. So after the Sarnoff fellowship, which obviously was a defining moment for you in your career, tell us about residency and fellowship.
Sure. So I did residency at University of Washington in Seattle, and continued to do, and UW is a great residency. All the residents there at the time, there was no formal ER program at the time. So the emergency room rotation at this inner city hospital called Harborview was run by medicine residents and surgical residents. And that was like the crown jewel of the residency. And that was another incredible experience, really impactful, a place to work and train. And I was also continuing to do cardiovascular research. I worked with Wayne Levy, who was another impactful mentor for me, right when he was kind of designing the Seattle heart failure score. And I was working on, actually, we were trying to see if cytokines would be predictive of outcomes in the Seattle heart failure score or in a heart failure cohort, and they weren't. They're too, they can vary so much in a short period of time, so they kind of lose their ability to have any kind of predictive value. But nonetheless, I got to work with Wayne, which was an incredible experience, and he remains kind of a friend and someone I really admire. And then I'm from New York originally, so I wanted to get back to New York, and I did a fellowship at Mount Sinai in New York. So I moved from Boston to Seattle, and then from Seattle back to New York, and started my general cardiology fellowship at Mount Sinai.
So, again, a great place to train, right, and to do fellowship. And another aspect, although I mean, I've not been to same institutions, but I think the one aspect that is very again resonates with my career path is that for each pit stop, I call these pit stops in medicine training, right? Like, because there's so many pit stops before you eventually are on your own. I've gone through different institutions, like for residency, versus fellowship versus 2 more fellowships. All my institutions were different at each stage of the game. And I think there's something to be said about that. One, obviously you make a lot of connections, throughout your professional life. And you sort of also, I think it's a reset. And, you start from ground zero and, build your reputation up, versus if you're at the same hospital for, like med school residency, fellowship and other fellowships, sort of everybody knows you, you know everyone. There's like a comfort zone. So, if you change institutions, at least for me, it was like getting out of my comfort zone and getting uncomfortable again. And that was growth for me, at least to me, as I look back, that has always been growth for me. I don't know if you would agree or disagree.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's good to be a little bit uncomfortable. And I think, that really resonates with me as well. And I think also to just exposes you to things are done very differently at different places. There's different cultures, and it's great you kind of bring that with you. And then finally, you get exposed to a whole different group of mentors. So for all those reasons, I think it's good to kind of move around or think about that. And for different programs, I always encourage. San Diego, it's hard because no one wants to move. Everyone loves living here, but I always encourage residents to, you should spend a little time on the East Coast, or you should, check out the Midwest, or at least check out other institutions, because I think you just have that kind of pivotal moments at these places when you go into a new setting, and you can really get settled down and hit a flattening part in your growth curve if you stay in the same place forever. You're always kind of thought out in the same light. And so, my fellowship was great. It was at the time, our chair was also a program director. So Dr. Fuster was doing double duty, and he was another guy who was just so impactful on my career in subtle ways and in obvious ways, but you kind of absorb things from him and how he does things that I think impacts everybody that does that fellowship.
Yeah, I mean, boy, like between Joe Loscalzo and Valentin Fuster, like if you've had an opportunity to work with those two, I mean, you can't ask for a more distinguished training pathway, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So tell us more about that. Yeah, tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Fuster, he, the fellows, it was like we were almost like his Secret Service guarding him and worshiping him. We were all just enamored by him. And that was partially because of his dedication to us. We knew that, we knew he was such an international presence, but at the same time, he was so dedicated to the fellows. I remember he used to, wherever he was, he would fly back every Thursday to do these Fuster rounds, where you would tell him a patient and show him the EKG. You would give him a 3-liner on the patient or 2-liner on the patient, EKG and an X-ray. And then he would examine the patient, but he wasn't allowed to talk to the patient. And then he would make diagnoses. And he was right, I would say 85% of the time. And we would give him hard cases like atrial myxomas and dextrocardia, all kinds of unusual things. And he was almost always right, but you would learn no matter what. But part of it, what I learned is just his dedication, that the guy would make sure to come back 7 a.m. every Thursday to be there for the fellows. He might be in Spain and then he might be in Japan on Friday, but he would come back on Thursday to be with the fellows. And then part of it was really getting grounded in physical examination, which is still such a big part of what I do. And it's kind of a lost art, and it's a tragedy to me. And then his dedication to patients, patient care. So he even though he was so busy, he ran a really large clinic, and he would see people from all over. And he would be, you'd have celebrities, and then you'd have unusual cases, and then you just have other patients that he would see, and he treated everyone the same. And he was incredibly dedicated and methodical when it came to patient care. And so all those things kind of resonated, that it didn't matter who you were. At the end of the day, you realize that part of him being him was he was just this fantastic doctor. He taught the art of doctoring, and everyone got to spend a month in fellowship with him, or 2 months really, as the quote unquote Fuster fellow, where you go around and you're just seeing patients with him and you're managing his inpatient service. And that was just a ball. I mean, lots of interesting cases, lots of, amazing stories, things you do for these patients from, all over the world, royalty sometimes, various public figures. And, but it was really incredible. And then he was doing fantastic research at the same time. So he taught me how to write grants. He taught me a lot about doing clinical and basic research, because he was really the first translational person that I encountered, I would say, and that he was doing basic investigation, but is always clinically oriented, and that's kind of resonated with me ever since.
More than a couple things stand out, right, in that description. One is his dedication to fellowship and fellows. And it actually is not a surprise to me that when he took over the helm for Journal of American College of Cardiology, he came up with a fellows section, right? A fellows and an early career page section, which, I think was the first, for any major cardiology journal, and, others have followed suit. So that's one. And then, the second, which is almost nostalgic to my training at the All India Institute when I was a resident in India, was the classic bedside clinician, right? Which I agree with you. Like, it's sad that classic physician, like that classic I was saying Vanderbilt, because of Dr. Timothy Harrison, who wrote Harrison's Internal Medicine. When I was a resident, this is more than a decade ago in India, we still had those mentors to look up to clinically, as solid bedside clinicians who would, just need a physical exam and, the Victorian EKG and chest X-ray to make a clinical diagnosis. And that, I agree with you. I mean, that is lost. I don't see that anymore.
I agree. And, there's a lot of consequences of that. And the consequences may be, or I'm convinced that it causes more burnout, because there's so much joy that comes from that patient experience, from being at the bedside. And when you spend all day on an Epic terminal and you're barely in the room with the patient, there's obviously, I think there's a decrease in your ability to diagnose things as easily. And I think there's a lot to that, to just being good at the physical exam and being present and getting a history and spending time with the patient. But I think the joy of medicine is that experience. And when most of your time is spent on a computer screen, I see, and it's no fault of the fellows. It's just our residents. It's the demands on the EMR that they have to, but they're really missing out. So it doesn't surprise me that burnout is so high, because they're missing what for me was, and still is, such a big part of why we practice,
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. So that actually is a great segue to your current position as professor of medicine and as the director for, the medical director for heart transplant at UCSD. Tell us more about your current role, and how long have you been in that role, and what does the life of Eric Adler look like in 2021?
Sure. So I've been at UCSD for 10 years, and I remain kind of inspired by the Fusters and Loscalzos of the world in their ability to have a hand in research, a hand in education, and a hand in clinical practice. And I think that works well for my brain, my kind of ADD brain set or mindset. So I help with administratively with the transplant program, and have been doing that since I got here. Helped reorganize our program after it was kind of nascent for 8 or 9 years, and spent a lot of time recruiting and training heart failure fellows. I was the director of the Heart Failure Fellowship. I just gave that up recently, and we've done great things here clinically with our transplant program and our heart failure fellowship, which I helped start here. And then I still have an active, busy clinical practice. I do clinic 2 half days a week, one transplant clinic and one kind of cardiomyopathy, mostly genetic cardiomyopathy, or at least half genetic cardiomyopathy clinic. And then I have a research lab, and the lab is rooted in this idea of, can we identify the root cause of inherited cardiomyopathies and the pathobiology of inherited cardiomyopathies. And so that it's all very synergistic for me, because I'm inspired by the bedside all the time, and I bring that to the lab. And then I think a lot of the things I think about in the lab, I then kind of bring to the bedside, maybe more than others who aren't, thinking about autophagy and thinking about cell cycle and thinking about the things that you think about in the lab, but they can often resonate at the bedside. So there's this really nice kind of double-headed arrow between the bench and the bedside that has worked well, and continues to get me excited every day to go to work, or most days, not every day. Like everybody else, you have good days and bad days, but I think this ability to kind of switch gears and go back and forth for me is really, I consider myself incredibly lucky, and it has served as the inspiration for all my work.
So that's a lot of hats. There's an administrative hat. Obviously, there's the clinician hat, and then a basic / translational scientist hat. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who's in the early career phase and trying to wear all these different hats, how do you balance your responsibilities and roles and try and be progressive and productive and have a great academic output and clinical output and yet maintain a life? Like how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few different pearls or wooden pearls, I would say, and it changes right at different points in your career. But I think in that phase through fellowship and early career, I think Loscalzo once said to me, or he said, if you're going to do research and you're going to do clinical, make sure they're aligned. So your research, in other words, sometimes people will be doing research on ion channels and they're working on, their clinical work is in coronary disease. And it's just so much easier, more fulfilling if there's resonance between your research and your clinical work, so they can overlap. I think, if you're doing something and it seems like a chore, you're probably not doing the right thing. There's a quote by, and I forget his name, but a Olympic wrestler recently who said, "Sacrifice is what people do when they don't love what they're doing." So for me, if something feels like it's like it's painful, or you're procrastinating, or you're not looking forward to it, it's probably not the right research, or it's probably not the right thing for you, and so I think that's so important along the way, like continue to be inspired, and not just on the topics. Topics are important, but maybe even more importantly is the mentor. Always look for mentors, look for multiple mentors. You can have different mentors in your life, and make sure they inspire you, or they're not the right person. Can't just be the name, but it has to be the person. And if you have an inspirational mentor and that makes you passionate about the topic, it's not work anymore, right? You're doing it. You're thinking about it outside of work because you enjoy it. And so I think that's the secret. I think for resilience, it's important that and I've learned lessons the hard way, to be honest. Like, you have to be able to disconnect, and resilience comes from really carving out time off and being pretty strict about that time off. And that's not easy, whether that's clinical or research wise, but you need to kind of, I don't know, growing up to play video games, you think of those video game characters, like where you're running out of power before you die. You know what I'm talking about? Like the little power bars, like you have to recharge your power. And so it's important to be able to do that. But, the only other, so I think, just recapping, I think, find something that you love, find a mentor that inspires you, make sure that it doesn't feel like a chore. Another way to think about it is, what is procrastination? Like, we all procrastinate. If you think about it, procrastination is usually it usually procrastinate about things that you either don't enjoy or are hard, right? So if you're procrastinating all the time about a research topic, maybe it's not the right topic for you because you find you don't enjoy it, or you need more mentorship so that way you can understand it. But so I think about that a lot. Like, well, do things that you don't procrastinate on this because you probably are passionate about it. And then early in career, I think some of the mistakes I made, which I'm learning about now more and more, is it's really important to focus. And I think I spread myself too thin early on. I said yes to everybody. And so I was writing papers on migraines, and I was writing NPFOs, and then I was writing papers on and doing stem cell biology, and I was writing papers on palliative care, kind of all over the place. And you expel a lot of energy, but you don't actually move the ball forward. Whereas if you can really focus on a topic and start thinking about almost like your brand, who are you? What are you going to be known for? What are you going to really make a difference in the world about? If you can do that early and stay focused on it, you can be very impactful. I think of Les Cooper, who trained at UCSD and started doing, research on myocarditis when he was a fellow. And, he remains the kind of, the seminal authority on myocarditis to this day. So I think really being focused in your career in the early parts is very, very, very important. And Fuster used to say that to me all the time. He would just walk by me. He might be running a plane and he would be like, "Eric, focus." And I was like, what is he talking about? What does he mean? And I don't know if you've had that experience, but 10 years later, you think back about an encounter in a hallway when someone said one thing to you, like, that's what he meant. And so for me now, the idea of focusing on a topic and knowing what I'm going to, where I'm going to make a dent, thinking about I only have so much energy to give in so many areas. I wish I would have taken that more to heart earlier, but I certainly take that to heart now.
Yeah. So no, incredible insights. And, so couple things that have resonated here. So a shameless plug, you said make a dent. That actually is the name of my nonprofit.
Oh, that is so cool.
It's makeadent.org, which in part hosts these podcasts. So that's fun. So that just it was perfect. It's like perfect PR. So thanks for doing that.
I didn't know it, I promise.
So what you said is very important. So Dr. Kapadia says that to me all the time. It's like Ankur focus, he's my department chair. And,
he was my attending he was mentor for me at UW. He was a interventional attending.
Yeah,
and
awesome.
He's an amazing guy.
Yeah. He's a great guy. And so he says that to me, I just had my annual performance review. We have that as faculty every year. And he was going over, just scholarly activity and he's like, yeah, focus. And I think it's time for you to up the game and, start doing prospective studies. Cause, I mostly, all my research is observational,
right.
Looking into databases and, administrative databases and meta-analyses, what have you. And I was like, you're asking the right clinical questions, and you're getting stuff published in high impact journals. I think it's important for you to now focus on doing prospective stuff, because that's the next level for you at this stage in your career. So every time I see him, he's like, focus. It's like, okay, I get
it. And he's absolutely right.
Yeah, so that's one. My second would be, and I'm going through the same. I wouldn't call it a mistake. I think I'm just exploring myself. I think in part, if you're multifaceted, which I think a lot of cardiologists tend to be, or at least that's what I've come to be exposed to, going through these podcasts, with fascinating cardiologists, I think. I think Kaushik had done a clubhouse session with Marielle Jessup the other evening. And, she was also commenting on this, that, you can explore and then, find your niche. And it could be different for all of us. Or I'm sure you gained a lot of experience writing those papers on migraines. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, maybe it was just an experience, and, you were just exploring yourself, and, look, you're doing some incredible stuff with Danon disease. And, I think it's, maybe it was just your path, right? And each one of us is going to have our own different paths.
Yeah. And I think it's good. Everyone will say, learn how to say no. I think it's good to say yes a lot, especially early in your career. Mm-hmm. And so I think you don't want to be, I think you want to be open to things and trying things. And someone once explained it to me from a developmental biology standpoint, it's okay early on to be kind of this undifferentiated stem cell, or you think of a hematopoietic stem cell on its journey to become a platelet or a red blood cell, and you go through these different phases, but you slowly kind of learn things and whittle your way down, and then you move. And that process is, I do agree with you. I did learn a lot, and it's okay to, I think people don't realize it in their fellowship and early career, but people are really judging you. People are really taking note of you, and if you're the person that says no to everything all the time, people do kind of be like, oh, that guy, So I think it's good. It's good to help out, and it's good to try different things as you to figure out. And then when you find that kind of important thing, though, it's great. It's really good to hop on it for sure.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more that people are taking note of what you're doing. And how your ability to get things done also, right, is incredibly important. And I think your ability to stay clinically busy, productive, and yet be able to have, a portfolio, an academic portfolio, at least in an academic, career is extremely important, or at least that's what I've learned so far.
Yeah.
I'll be onto my fifth year. I would be onto my starting fifth year this summer. My last fellowship was in 2017, summer of 2017.
Gotcha.
So I couldn't agree with you more. And a lot of people and societies, define early career like everybody has a different definition. But I think for several years, right after your last fellowship is all early career. I don't know what you would say to that.
Yeah, I think those years, there's kind of this disconnect, and it's true regardless of what you're going to do, whether it's pure clinical practice, private practice, research, whatever it is, industry. Everyone kind of thinks, oh, when fellowship is over, that was the hard part. Now I get to move on. But actually, I would say the hardest years of training, maybe even, are those first 3 years as out of fellowship. And everyone, or most people, I should say, not everyone, I don't want to be too dogmatic, but most people struggle in those years. A lot of people switch jobs. A lot of people kind of move around. They're learning their practice. So it's a tough time, because all of a sudden, in June, you're a fellow, and in July, you're making the decisions, and fellowship now especially is so, obvious, depending on the fellowship, but there's so much oversight now and lack of autonomy in general. That's been a trend. So that part is really hard. And then making a career for yourself academically in those first few years is really important. Um, in the academic sphere, especially, it's just so important early to have a mentor that looks out for you and that quote unquote protecting you and that's available to you. That can make or break everything, you know.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And, I switched my first job, after, like a year and 6 months. I couldn't agree with you more that, actually early career is the most, I think, maybe I think turbulence is an appropriate word to describe it, because I think there's a lot of, I think self-discovery, right? Like how you make decisions, like what biases you have. And, like clinically, what decisions you're making, whether it's taking care of patients in the ICU or in the cath lab or, as outpatient clinic, you're discovering yourself. You're discovering, your decision-making abilities and also, your interaction with peers, with seniors, with fellows. So there's a lot of self-discovery, I would say. And like academically, I mean, it's tough. Like you want to establish yourself clinically. At least that was an important, milestone for me. And also still trying to be productive academically can be extremely taxing on you. And, I think biologically, like, for me, like I was, we were also starting a family. So.
Exactly. That's the heart that's common. And I think, if you think about it, it's such a hard time because you're juggling right when you're needed most at home is when you're making your mark at work. It's this. And so I see that a lot in junior faculty. It's all the confluence of this personal stuff, which is really important at that age usually, and professional stuff where you're really needed and need to make your mark. So it's tremendously stressful. It's stressful on families. It's stressful on relationships. People think, and in relationships, especially, people think you're done. You're done. So now is the good part because you've kind of been waiting to be done, right? And then you realize, well, oh, actually, this is just the beginning. Wait, I'm working. There's no work hour restrictions for me anymore, right? So it's like you're working the hardest you are. So you're building, but I would say that's the time when you've got to kind of, this is, there's usually not an easy way out, and it's putting your head down and recognizing that people are kind of taking stock of you, whether you like it or not. Your patient interactions, people are tempted to say, oh, that's the researcher who doesn't know what they're doing clinically, or that's the clinical person who doesn't know any idea about research. So if you're going to try to balance and juggle these things, you've got to be excellent at both. You've got to do, you can't be okay at either. So it's a challenging time. It can be a really fulfilling time, an exciting time, because you get to make your mark. But that's where having the right job, and it's funny, so many fellows are so stressed about that first job decision, and I understand why it's stressful. But in hindsight, part of me is thinking, oh, you might change your job anyways. Don't worry too hard. Most people do, anyways, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I mean, like the national statistics are like, it's like 66% or 70% people switch jobs within the first year.
Right.
And that's out of the ACC committee, that paper.
I believe it.
Yeah.
I believe it.
Yeah. ACC committee. So great insights. And thank you for sharing that with us, Eric. That's going to be pearls of wisdom for our listenership. So tell us about, your research with inherited cardiomyopathies. That's the exciting part.
Sure. Yeah. So I think well, a lot of this again started for me at the bedside, and when I look back at most of the research endeavors, it's inspired by patient interactions. But my work in genetic cardiomyopathies really started right around let's see. So 2003, 2000, I would say 2006 rather, we were learning that you could make stem cells from people's skin. This idea, Shinya Yamanaka's idea of making pluripotent stem cells from skin. And I was doing a lot of research on regenerative medicine, on making embryonic stem cells into cardiac myocytes. And I had been part of a lab, another mentor of mine named Gordon Keller, who's like a seminal stem cell researcher who developed a way of making embryonic stem cells in cardiomyocytes. And right when that was happening, Shinya Yamanaka was coming up with a way of making this from skin. And what that did is it allowed us to take skin samples from patients and use those to make cardiomyocytes, beating cardiomyocytes. And right away, this, I had a light bulb go off like, wow, we're going to be able to study human cardiovascular disease in a way we've never done it before, because we're going to be able to study human cardiomyocytes in the lab, in the dish at a molecular level. So I first started doing that with patients that had long QT syndrome. So those were patients, I took care of a patient who had a cardiac arrest and made pluripotent stem cells from them and studied long QT that way. And then I continued to be inspired by various patient interactions as a heart failure cardiologist. And I would carry around a skin biotome with me and take little pieces of skin. And everyone's like, who's this crazy person who's doing skin biopsy? But what I was doing was bringing back cells to the lab. And I was part of a group that made the first kind of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy model in the dish from a disease called Leopard syndrome. And that was in 2008, something like that. I subsequently moved to Oregon for my second job at OHSU, and I was taking care of a patient who died unexpectedly and with both a cardiac and skeletal myopathy. And we never really figured out what was going on. He had a skeletal biopsy that suggested possibly Pompe syndrome. But in the lab, we had taken his cells and brought him back to the lab. And a fellow that was working with me named Stacey Clegg, she grew out, I had taught her this technique, and she grew out the cells and made cardiomyocytes and figured out that it was Danon. It wasn't Pompe's. And I didn't even know what Danon was, but we sequenced the cells ourselves. We found the mutation. We made a model of disease, and we've been really focused. I've been very, finally taking my advice to heart and Dr. Fuster's advice to heart, and said, I'm going to focus on this disease because not many people were studying it. And I knew it was it's a disease. It's a disease in extreme, like Danon have the heaviest hearts ever described on record. It has almost 100% penetrance in boys. So because of these kind of terrible features of the disease, it makes it actually compelling for study and learning a lot of biology. It's a disorder of autophagy, and autophagy is this process that's, ubiquitous in every cell, but particularly important in the heart, probably related to diabetes. So it resonates a lot, the study, understanding the autophagy. So we use Danon to study how autophagy works in the heart, how the heart recycles proteins, which is what autophagy essentially is. And then more recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, have decided, there was a pivot point for me where I said, well, I can just study basic mechanisms, or I can really try to develop a therapy. And so based on, a lot of patients started contacting me because they knew, patients with Danon, I started to really empathize for people who are suffering from rare diseases, because no one studies these, no one understands these patients, right? When they go all over the place before they're even diagnosed. So they're reaching out to me from Australia and from all over the United States, like, thank you for studying Danon. We know basically the moms know their kids are going to die by age 20. So it inspired my research, and we decided to switch, and as opposed to just being mechanistic, to do translational research, and have developed a gene therapy in the lab for Danon. And that's now in clinical trials. And it's really exciting to see something, it started at the bedside from a patient bring it back to the lab. We developed this gene therapy, and then go back to patient care. And it's only possible because of all these mentors I've, along the way, whether it was Dr. Fuster or Roger Ajara was a mentor for me in doing gene therapy at the time. So I was getting to engage with him some. And I mentioned Gordon Keller, who helped me learn about stem cells. So all these kind of things came together between patient care and research. And that's really morphed now to where I really think we're on a precipice of addressing quote unquote idiopathic cardiomyopathy in a new way, where we can look at the root causes, whether it's amyloid, and there's a lot of obviously research on amyloid and new therapies for amyloid, but all these different genetic cardiomyopathies, we know there's a genetic root cause, and now with technology we can, up titrate or down titrate almost any gene. And that's going to allow us, as opposed to being reactive when we treat cardiomyopathy, to be proactive. So I think it's the dawn of kind of this new era in cardiomyopathy. I think Danon is what we've done in Danon may, and hopefully will be one example of a very rare disease that we took this approach in. But I think there's many more. I think a lot of people are starting to recognize that. So, just like cancer was 15 years ago when people had cancer, if you had lung cancer, they treated the same. If you had breast cancer, they treated the same. Now everything is based on the molecular root cause, and we're seeing changes. I'm hoping that happens in cardiomyopathy. I'm very optimistic that we're on the precipice of changing it. I was actually in the ER yesterday with my daughter who had some allergy, and the ER doctor was explaining to my daughter, sometimes we call something idiopathic, but it's really idiopathic. We just don't want our patients to know that we're an idiot, that we don't know what we're talking about. And I thought that's funny. And I said, maybe hopefully that's true of idiopathic cardiomyopathy, that we're actually don't know what we're talking about, but we need to do that. And as a consequence, we can develop new therapies. So that's kind of front and center of what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. It's very inspirational. Your description of the discovery of the path that you took to, hopefully, I'm crossing my fingers, hopefully cure, Danon disease. I mean, it would be tremendous for all those families, right? And, I'm sure the connections that you've made internationally and the families that you've come to know, and they're all praying, as I am, because I think the most special. Well, first off, I think the fact that hope is incredible, right? Like hope is that quintessential feeling or emotion, or the existence of hope is everything for anyone. And I think if you can, so there's a sliver of hope for all these families and for all these kids and you're sort of, you're their North Star. So
they're our North Star. The most impactful thing I did was make sure that families come by the lab and that the families meet the physicians doing the research, because it just all of a sudden becomes so much bigger than, I have to go, do this gel or read this EKG. Once you see the impact that your work could have and how many people are counting on you, all of a sudden everyone is inspired. So I think trying to make improving quality of life and quantity of life and keeping that the North Star for everyone doing these projects, it's so important, whether it's your study coordinators, the statisticians, people in the whoever it is, like constantly remind them of the mission, or whatever you're doing in life, like being rooted in your mission. And that mission can be hope for sure, and providing hope. It makes it so impactful for everybody. It's like a life force. I hate to sound philosophical, but it becomes the kind of the center for both the patients and the providers. You're on the same team.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And, that's what, that's the driver, right? Like, that's the light that you're,
yep.
That's the energy. That's the genesis of your energy for getting up and going to work every day.
Absolutely.
And that's so important. Like for all of us to find that source of inspiration is key to, I mean, I think so. I mean, and when you have that, you'll never burn out. Like burnout will never happen.
It's funny too, because so many people in life, they get drawn to money as if money is going to be that North Star. But the people who are really successful, the money, all those things come, but it's really the cause that is what's prizing the satisfaction, and if it always just becomes about how I can make more, those are usually the most unhappy people, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. Boy, it's like 58 minutes and 44 seconds. It's been such a great conversation. Like I didn't even realize how this hour went by. And thank you so much for doing this, Eric. Any closing remarks for our listenership, for our audience? And thanks again so much for your time and for spending the evening with us.
Well, I'm just so grateful for giving me the opportunity and just getting to chat with you. And I think we've got to hit on a lot of really important topics. So I'm happy and available to talk to people as things come up, and keep focusing on your, it sounds cheesy, but I believe it. Focus on what you're passionate about, and that's the definition of success, and you'll be there. So and be generous with others, because they'll help build you up even more. So be constantly mentoring others, and you'll get the more satisfaction than you ever imagined. So
yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. So again, thanks everyone for tuning in, and you know how to leave us a feedback. If anyone wants to speak in person with Dr. Adler, Eric, is there an email they can write you, or?
Yeah, sure. They can, I'm on Twitter, or they can email me at eradler@health.ucsd.edu, or if you Google me, there's links to my lab's website and contact info. So feel free. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, perfect. And we'll make sure that the show notes have this information also. And thanks again, Eric.
Thanks for reaching out. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, likewise.
All right, take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed today's podcast, produced by Radcliffe Cardiology in association with makeadent.org. We aim to bring you a new angle of all things cardiology every second week. Review us on your favourite podcast app, or send your comments or questions to podcast@radcliffe-group.com. To view the series, head to radcliffecardiology.com/podcasts/Parallax. Thanks for listening.